All right, my friends, here we go. Welcome, everyone, to Season 5 of National Parks Presents. Today is our fourth of 6 presentations. We've been doing this since mid-January, and these presentations take place every other Wednesday to the end of March. We used to go to April, but honestly, spring is in April, and it's really when everyone's running outside. I know I'm running outside. I hope you guys explored the day today, because the weather and the sun, it makes a big difference. So this season we were like, you know what, it's a good time, end of March. That's a good time. So this goes from January to March. And in that April time, when you're like, oh, I can't get my national parks fix, where's my history? Go check out the National Parks of Boston. They have amazing programs. They really have stellar walking tours. They have events. They have programs. Honestly, they are absolutely incredible. There's a reason why I beg them year after year to come back, being like, please keep going, because the information is incredible and very, very fun. And also, you're in the city of Boston. Boston is killing it with its history. All right, so go explore it. Before we get into the rest of my stuff, I'm going to go over some of our Zoom features today. If this is your first time coming to a presentation, welcome. I do want to let you know that we are recording, so you are welcome to catch up on this presentation, past presentations, on the BPL YouTube page. The link is honestly long. I'll throw it in the chat in a moment, but the best way to find our YouTube page is go to Google, type in BPL YouTube, and it'll be right there. Okay, so all of them are there. If you are not enjoying the captions that are probably kind of popping up on your screen, you are welcome to turn those off. You hit the CC in the Zoom menu button and those will turn off. Also, some people don't enjoy sometimes the chat box that's usually in the bottom right of your screen. You can X out of that as well. It won't disturb the, what do I want to call it? It won't shut off Ranger Jen and her information. It'll just turn off the box itself, so you don't keep seeing the words pop up on the screen. Okay, but if you do enjoy a live chat, the chat box is where you will type in your questions, all right? Like I said, this is probably one of our largest groups that we've had, and we usually don't keep the chat box open because it's like, ooh, what's gonna happen? We don't know. But honestly, you guys are amazing. You're such a fun audience. You're a knowledgeable audience. You love to share. You're so kind. So it's a rare program that we keep this chat box open. So you are welcome to ask all of your questions. Do not be shy. We ask you to follow the Aretha Franklin rule, which is be respectful. All right. We have to be respectful. When you type in your question, just notice the to form, okay? Notice who you're sending it to. If you want to send it to everyone, that's awesome. It's going to be everyone sitting at home and on the screen, or you can send it to hosts and panelists. That is everyone you see on the screen, which is just the 4 of us. And the wonderful Ranger Sean will be monitoring the chat. There we go. It's the end of the day, so some of my words get a little mixed up, but he'll be watching the chat and pulling your questions. And at the end, he will pop back on the screen and ask your questions to Ranger Jen. After the program, if you could fill out the survey that will pop up on the screen at the end, that would be awesome. And without further babbling from me, let's welcome Ranger Jennifer Steele as she presents Emancipation in Massachusetts.
Thank you, Karen. All right, if you give me a second to share my screen, and then I'll introduce myself and get this program started. I think you can see my, oh no. Now I think you can see my screen. I feel situated. All right, good evening. My name is Jen. I'm a ranger with the National Parks of Boston. So just to cover the 3 national parks of Boston, starting with Boston National Historical Park. So if you've ever visited the Freedom Trail downtown, sites in Charlestown, like the home of the USS Constitution in the Charlestown Navy Yard, or the Bunker Hill Monument, learning about the battle upcoming this June 17th, 1775, the 250th anniversary. We've got some exciting history here. Also great places to check out, like the Boston Harbor Islands National and State Park, So 34 islands and peninsulas that make up that site. Then last but not least, Boston African American National Historic Site, which I'll kind of focus on more today, but themes of abolition, the Black Heritage Trail in Beacon Hill. And I'd just like to say thank you for joining my presentation today on emancipation in Massachusetts. And I could still say it, even though there's only a couple days left. Happy Black History Month. So I'll get started with my presentation here. You might see I have a little snippet of a poem by our one and only Phyllis Wheatley. So I'll read, "Hail, happy day, when smiling like the morn, fair freedom rose New England to adorn. The northern clime, beneath her genial ray, Dartmouth, congratulates thy blissful sway. Elate with hope, her race no longer mourns. Each soul expands, each grateful bosom burns, while in thine hand, with pleasure we behold, the silken reins and freedom's charms unfold." So this is just a section from a poem Phyllis wrote to the Right Honorable William Earl of Dartmouth. She praises the Earl of Dartmouth for his support of freedom for Black Americans and recognizes his leadership as a sign of hope for enslaved people. Her references throughout the rest of the poem to freedom and tyranny really resemble language used by colonists during the American Revolution. We'll get back to Phyllis, but that's how I wanted to start off today's presentation. I don't know if Karen mentioned it, but the theme for this year is also revolutionary art. So chose to focus on a piece of art being poetry. You're going to see that I've used some art pieces throughout Boston or to capture some of this history. So one other art piece I'll start with is the Middle Passage Port Marker, so a public art installation on Long Wharf. So kind of downtown Boston, if you're not as familiar, beautiful view of the harbor there. But this really recognizes, this marker recognizes a point of entry for ships transporting kidnapped Africans, enslaved people to Boston, or Boston's role in the transatlantic slave trade. Puritan settlers enslaved people shortly after settling or colonizing Massachusetts. The land that we're referring to as Massachusetts, or today Boston, was home to the Massachusetts people. Throughout the 1600s, enslavement in New England heavily relied upon captive natives and eventually kidnapped Africans. And actually in 1637, Captain William Pierce sailed the Desire from Boston with enslaved people from the Pequot Nation. He'd return a year later, bringing the first recorded shipment of kidnapped Africans to Boston, according to Governor John Winthrop's journal. And this was erected on Long Wharf in 2020. Just for this next section or two, I'll focus on some key Black figures who made contributions that impacted our national and local history. They even paved the way for the emancipation movement. So just starting with Zipporah Potter Atkins. She was the first African-American female landowner in Boston, or even just African-American landowner in Boston, minus the female part, in 1670. So this piece here was installed to recognize the site of her former home on the what is now the Rose F. Kennedy Greenway near the North End. It was installed in 2014. You can kind of see what it reads, but I'll go through some of the history, which also touches upon it. She was born in 1645, passed in 1705. Her parents, Richard and Grace, were enslaved by Captain Richard Keene, and she was born free. She inherited money through her father, used to purchase property that she lived at in 1670. So she was a North End resident for a little bit over 20 years. And she sold her home in 1699 and then received another title of a first African woman to sign her initials on a deed in Suffolk County. She is laid to rest at Copp's Hill Burying Ground, which is also in the North End. So moving into the Revolutionary era, might be familiar with this name, Crispus Attucks, a victim of the Boston Massacre. He was born in 1723, passed away in 1770. But this painting was by Herschel Levitt, a mural of Crispus Attucks. It's at the Recorder of Deeds building in DC, and he painted that in 1943. For Attucks, his father was an enslaved African, and his mother was a member of the Wampanoag tribe. He was a sailor in Framingham, Massachusetts. And he's known to be not only a victim, but the first victim of the Boston Massacre. Next week, we'll celebrate the anniversary or acknowledge the anniversary of the Boston Massacre, March 5th, 1770. His eulogies were held at Faneuil Hall, and he is buried at the Granary Burying Ground, which is in downtown Boston along the Freedom Trail. And now back to Phyllis Wheatley. African-American female poet. This is a lithograph by the publisher Pendleton, which is printed in Boston. You might be familiar with her background. She was born in West Africa, circa 1753. She arrives in Boston in July 11th, 1761, named after the ship that brought her here. She was purchased by John and Susanna Wheatley. They were members of Old South Meeting House Congregational Church, again, on the Freedom Trail. And actually, she is the first African-American female poet to have a book of poems published. The title was Poems on Various Subjects, Religious and Moral, published in London in 1773. And actually, a shipment of her books was one of the ships that was raided during the Boston Tea Party, December 16th, 1773. She did receive her freedom and married a free Black man, John Peters. But unfortunately, Phyllis passed at a pretty young age, at 31 years old in 1784. She is also one of the 3 women featured in the Boston Women's Memorial on Commonwealth Ave. I didn't put that art piece here, but if you're local, definitely try to check it out. It's Phyllis, Abigail Adams, and Lucy Stone. Before we move into the efforts of the Emancipation movement, I wanted to acknowledge the efforts of Black Americans who fought in the American Revolution. Some of the people fighting may have thought that their support, whether it was for the Patriots or the British, through the Lord Dunmore's proclamation, would move them closer to freedom. So some Black Americans in the American Revolution. For this art piece, this one's a watercolor by a French artist. This has been one of the things I was worried about this evening, which is saying this guy's name, Jean-Baptiste Antoine de Verger, circa 1781. And this is capturing some soldiers in the Yorktown campaign, but really highlighting that first one, Black infantrymen from the 1st Rhode Island Regiment. Some folks from Massachusetts joined that regiment, but this is really just to help me have some sort of depiction of some Black military participation. So we just want to talk about some of the people who would have fought here in Massachusetts, starting with Barzillai Lou. He was in the Massachusetts 27th Regiment. He fought at the Battle of Lexington and Concord. If you tuned in last year, the theme was music. So I talked about Lou since he played the flute. He's from Dracut, Massachusetts. Moving on to Peter Salem. He fought at the Battle of Bunker Hill. I'd also acknowledge that 5% of the soldiers who fought at Bunker Hill were Black patriots. Salem's also known to have fired the shot that killed British Major John Pitcairn. And Primus Hall, son of Prince Hall. He enlisted as a private in the Continental Army, and he participated during the siege of Boston. So now we're going to move on to really talk about some emancipation efforts in Massachusetts, starting with Prince Hall. This drawing here of Prince Hall is an unknown illustration. You can see he's wearing an African lodge sash. I'll be curious, anyone using the chat, if you are familiar with Prince Hall and some of his contributions to the area. He was born enslaved, manumitted in 1770. He was an abolitionist, education rights advocate. He founded the Prince Hall Freemasonry and the African Lodge No. 1. He served in the American Revolution and was a member of the African Society. He started his campaign for abolition around 1773, but after 1776, he started to use language from the Declaration of Independence to form his argument in support of natural rights for Black Americans. So I have some of his petitions here, starting in the middle with 1777. His petition for freedom: naturally born citizens, or 7 African Americans, including Hall, quoted the Declaration of Independence language, really trying to petition for this freedom to the Massachusetts state legislation. Unfortunately, this fails, but still one of the earlier attempts in the emancipation movement here in the state of Massachusetts, or the Commonwealth. And later on in 1788, he petitions the General Court. And that's actually after 3 Black men were kidnapped, taken from Boston Harbor to the West Indies. This petition was an attempt to prohibit the slave trade in Massachusetts. With the support of another Quaker petition, it actually passed March 26, 1788. But in this next section, this is really where it's key in supporting the emancipation movement, which would be freedom petitions or legal cases fought here in the state of Mass. Might be familiar with Elizabeth Freeman, or Mum Bet, and her legal case. Before I talk about Elizabeth Freeman, I would just acknowledge that I'm going to be referring to the Massachusetts State Constitution, unless you're really into your state history and legal cases, might not be as familiar. So just for some background, the Massachusetts Bay Colony Charter was revoked in 1684. A new charter for the Massachusetts Bay was established in 1691. But finally adopting or ratifying a Massachusetts state constitution in 1780 is what I'll be referring to. And there's this specific quote that all men are created free and equal that will be used as some ammo for some of these legal cases. So starting with Elizabeth Freeman's, she was born around 1744. This is a miniature portrait or watercolor on ivory by Susan Ann Livingston Ridley Sedgwick in 1811. You can see she's wearing a typical federal style dress. I have also read that that necklace that she's wearing is now turned into a bracelet that still exists today. But she was enslaved in Sheffield, Mass. And her name as an enslaved person was Mum Bet. Her story goes, she attempted to protect her sister from her enslaver's violence, which led to her to sue for her legal freedom in 1781. With the support of her lawyer, Theodore Sedgwick, who argued that the state constitution contradicted the institution of slavery, she was able to win her legal case, Brom and Bet versus Ashley. Mum Bet's legal case was a freedom suit that impacted the decision to overturn enslavement in the Commonwealth. After her emancipation, she rebranded as Elizabeth Freeman. She has this quote, very powerful one. She says, anytime while I was a slave, if 1 minute's freedom had been offered to me, and I had been told I must die at the end of that minute, I would have taken it. Just to stand 1 minute on God's earth as a free woman, I would. If it weren't for her freedom suit and some others, we may not have seen emancipation here in Massachusetts. And some others, I'd really refer to the Quock Walker cases. Quock Walker actually self-liberated himself. It's one way of saying he was a fugitive or ran away from enslavement in 1781. His enslaver made a false promise, providing his freedom at 25 years old, and that he did not follow through on that promise, which led to Walker versus Jennison. Was brought in front of Chief Justice William Cushing of the Massachusetts Supreme Judicial Court, who sided actually with Walker, referencing that phrase, all men are created free and equal. And with that, enslavement ended in 1783, and emancipation prevailed. I'll move on at this point to talk about some of the communities that would form thereafter, but also acknowledging Boston's Black community members not only lived and contributed throughout this growing town, but faced challenges. Racial barriers continued to exist. But they lived in boroughs like the North End and Beacon Hill before moving outward to places like South Boston, Roxbury, and Dorchester later in the 19th and 20th centuries. So although the practice of enslavement ended here in Massachusetts, there would be abolitionists and activists throughout the state, especially here in the heart of Boston. It becomes a hotbed of abolition. So community members would continue to fight for equal rights. One of them being Colonel George Middleton. Middleton is also a Revolutionary War veteran. His home is to the right here. That's 5 Pinckney Street, a site on the Black Heritage Trail. He lived here with Louis Glapian as well. One of the earlier community members who passes away in 1815, and a little bit less is known about Middleton, but we know that he was a part of this group called the Bucks of America. So you see their core flag to the left of the screen. This is a hand-sewn flag, white and blue silk. You can see there are 13 stars in this blue rectangle or square. And there's a stag, that buck, under a pine tree. And there is an inscription up top, which I'll get to, but this was gifted to the Bucks. They're also known as the Protectors. They're basically security or day and night watchmen, an all-Black militia group during the siege of Boston, although there are no official military records. And I would also acknowledge not only a member of the Bucks of America, he was a horsebreaker, a community activist, even played the violin, sorry. He attended Trinity Church and married his wife Elsie there. He'd also go on to be the 3rd Grand Master of the Prince Hall Masonic Lodge. And that inscription that I was referring to kind of brings me to my next person who focuses on colored patriots of the American Revolution, which is William Cooper Nell. William Cooper Nell was a local community member, abolitionist. He also has a home, or had a home, in Beacon Hill that's on the Black Heritage Trail. He opened up that home as a safe house or stop on the Underground Railroad, harboring fugitives. He was a school integrationist for Black students to receive an equal education to white students in Boston. And his home is actually across the street from the Abiel Smith School. So that's the first school for students of color. Nell and other activists or integrationists fought for that equal education for students there, since they were suffering and not providing students of color similar materials or recognition. And the Abiel Smith School, by the way, is now the exhibit space of the Museum of African American History in Beacon Hill. But this book that Nell writes, according to the Colored Patriots of the American Revolution, he talks about how Governor John Hancock and his son, John George Washington Hancock, presented the Bucks flag to the group. So that inscription up at the top of the flag was JGWH. Potentially, some speculate, referring to Governor Hancock's son, who helped present that flag. But this book used rhetoric or language that refers to independence. Many abolitionists referred to the ideals of freedom and independence that sparked the events here in Boston during the Revolution to acknowledge their own intention to continue the fight for equality regarding the case or cause of enslavement. Kind of reminds me of Phyllis and her poems. Nell joined the Boston Vigilance Committee that sought to protect freedom seekers, especially after the passing of a tougher federal fugitive slave law. And If you're not as familiar, the Fugitive Slave Law of 1850, or is passed in 1850 with the Compromise of 1850. It allowed slave catchers to return fugitives to enslavers despite the emancipated Commonwealth. It also had some harsh punishment for those who were harboring fugitives. But with the continuation and leading up towards the American Civil War, Boston was hopeful, or abolitionists were hopeful. Some people kind of knew that on the horizon was the Emancipation Proclamation. For this slide here, to the right, you can see kind of a scene there. We have white and black folks, both men and women, kind of waiting. This is called the Watch Meeting, December 31st, 1862, also known as the Waiting for the Hour, by Hurd and Mosley, a carte de visite. And it says the address is 10 Tremont Row, Boston. President Abraham Lincoln signed the Emancipation Proclamation, and it passed January 1st, 1863. It attempted to free enslaved individuals in the rebel Confederate states, and it also opened up military services to allow Black men. The U.S. Constitution, though, officially abolished slavery toward the ends of the Civil War with the passing of the 13th Amendment. But someone who is a large contributor to the Emancipation Proclamation is well-known abolitionist Frederick Douglass. He was waiting on New Year's Eve at Tremont Temple, anticipating the announcement of the Emancipation Proclamation. He definitely was a large factor in encouraging Lincoln to pass the Emancipation Proclamation and allow Black men to contribute to the victory for the Union Army. And when word reached this celebration, Douglass led the crowd singing the spiritual, "Blow ye the trumpet blow." He then went on to keep partying, and he went with some other community members, kept the spirits high in the north slope of Beacon Hill at 12th Baptist Church, also known as Fugitive Slaves Church. You could also see this art piece to the left. Might be familiar if you've been on the Black Heritage Trail, the Star, or even just in downtown Boston by the Common, right in front of the State House. We have the Robert Goldshaw in Massachusetts 54th Regiment Memorial. It was completed by sculptor Augustus St. Gaudens. His home is also a national park site in New Hampshire. It was unveiled on Memorial Day, May 31st, 1897. It took him 14 years, about 14 years to complete. So like I said, the Emancipation Proclamation allowed the recruitment for Black troops for the Union Army. Governor John Albion Andrews worked with Douglass to begin the recruitment of Black troops in the spring of 1863. Douglass went on a speaking tour. He delivered the speech, "A Call to Colored Men to Take Arms." The 54th Regiment established themselves and began to train in Camp Meigs by Hyde Park. There is a small park there that has a sign acknowledging their training grounds. Governor Andrews visits them. He gives them regiment flags. And Beacon Hill's African Meeting House was used as a recruitment station for the newly formed 54th Regiment. For this slide, the art piece that I've chosen is Storming Fort Wagner. It was a print by Kurtz and Allison, done in 1890. Also acknowledging another Douglass connection, two of his sons enlisted as members of the 54th Regiment. Despite the recruitment of Black troops, the military remained segregated. Black soldiers endured discrimination as members of the Union Army. Black troops were not provided fair compensation as they were promised. Soldiers boycotted their pay, wrote letters to Lincoln, and eventually received back pay for their efforts. But once they headed down to South Carolina in the spring of 1863, they participated in battle for the first time. This is the Battle of Fort Wagner, July 18th, 1863. The 54th Regiment were asked to lead the charge. Although it was an unsuccessful Union victory, and nearly half of the regiment lost their lives. It shows what these men were willing to endure for a sacrifice that they cared about. Got to be honest, I know we're pretty early, but that is what I have prepared for this evening. So hopefully you are here for a short uh, talk on emancipation, because that's what I've got. I would also shout out to some of the great resources I was able to utilize, like the Massachusetts Historical Society has great in-depth information on emancipation in Massachusetts. There's a great exhibit done by the city's archaeology team. If you look up um, I'm forgetting the name. If Sean could help me out at one point, or we could drop a link. But it's an exhibit at Faneuil Hall that also has a complement online that was helpful in some of my research. But I'm here for questions, and we can start to open it up. But like I said, I'm really sorry. I thought that I had put too much information in my slides, and apparently I could have kept going. So I'll stop sharing.
All good, all good. Thank you, Jen. Okay, we did have a couple of questions, and I know that people are dropping, you're welcome to drop more questions in the chat. I will keep monitoring it as we go. So first question is, do you know where any of the Black Patriots that you mentioned are buried in Boston?
That's a great question. There's a couple of different graveyards, but for some of the ones that I was discussing, I think some of that is kind of lost to history, especially in a time where there were unmarked graves. So we have a great resource online, like The Patriots of Color, which is also a book. But a lot of the team has done some great work to kind of capture that online, which I could also provide a link to that. But I saw you added the one for the archaeology, the slavery exhibit that I was referring to. But I'm sorry, I don't have an exact name right now. I forgot to mention Prince Hall is buried at Copp's Hill, but sometimes it's also subject, kind of lost to history.
Yeah, there's the NPB Patriots of Color page. As Jen said, wonderful amount of resources. Um,
The
yeah, so
book,
then
I'm sorry, I didn't mean to cut you, but the book is by George Quintel, right?
yeah, I think that one of them is, yes. Great. Wondering if you could speak a little bit in I think you can use kind of any of the examples that you just gave. And I know that there was some kind of chatter back and forth in the chat. Um, Someone was interested about hearing the transition from enslavement to freedom. Just for individuals during the Revolutionary period, Phyllis Wheatley was thrown out there. Obviously, you discussed, Elizabeth Freeman Mumbeck, Quock Walker. Do you have any of the stories of those folks as they transitioned to freedom and what that might have been like?
Yeah, just using a couple that I referred to as an example, like Prince Hall was manumitted around the time of the Boston Massacre. There's a theory or so, like Professor Jared Hardesty. I actually ran into him once, kind of sharing some of his great resources, talking about like why enslavers would choose to emancipate their enslaved people. There could be moments in events in time, like Boston Massacre, around the time where there's discussions about freedom and independence and kind of the contradiction of enslaving people. For Phyllis, her enslavers were seen as very respectful, but she was an enslaved person, basically their property. So then she actually receives her emancipation. And then there also is like that layer of marriage, to be an enslaved person but marry a freed person. So I think there's some complicated ways, but ultimately those freedom suits were able to kind of abolish, not kind of, abolish enslavement here in the state.
Yeah, and I think that definitely, like as you were saying, the transition is something that would have been, difficult in many cases. And obviously varies depending upon who it was and where they were and what resources they had available. We did have another question about the slave trade in general in Boston. Could you speak a little bit to how extensive the slave trade was in the city?
Yeah, which again is another great resource. Like we could drop a link to the right to our NPS website. Even thinking of and that I would also refer to the city's slavery exhibit, talking about some of the people who were selling kidnapped Africans, which we know up until a certain point there was the state was allowing the slave trade. And some of these wealthy merchants like Peter Faniel, not only selling kidnapped Africans, but cargo going back and forth from the state. So we have that map or resources where it kind of talks about that transaction of people or products. Um, I could go even further, but I definitely think that some of those resources would definitely help to kind of capture what exactly you might be looking for.
Great. Yeah, and I just dropped in a link to our Middle Passage article in the chat, which speaks to has a bunch of different resources in it as well. And I don't if you don't know this, that's fine. But do you have any examples of what like the public reaction was to emancipation in Massachusetts? Did citizens support the change? Indifferent? Do you have resources to that?
Yeah, well, especially I talked about the kind of celebration at Tremont Temple, or the heart of the abolition movement in Beacon Hill would have been both in support and very excited. I think it was one of those things where it kind of was a symbol of hope. You know, if this state would or if this was able to be done, obviously for Confederate states, but also to allow Black men to participate in the Army, then it could be the potential for what was to come, which we know now as the 13th Amendment.
Great. All right. Well, I'm not seeing any additional questions in the chat right now. Thank you very much, Jen. Really appreciate. Very concise overview. Oh, we do have apparently I missed one. Feel free to drop that question in the chat. I did not see it, so I apologize. Well, it was a question about contracting to assist with genealogy, I believe. I think that someone did drop in an appointment about genealogy booking with a Boston Public Library with a librarian from the BPL, which I'm copying and pasting and dropping that into the chat. And then if you don't know this again, totally fine. Another question did come in. Who was the first Black elected, first African American elected to city council or other municipal offices? Do you know that? And if not, again, I don't know that.
Yeah, the first, I can't say that I know that off the top of my head, especially like from what I know, just like elected officials, not just the city council. So that's a good question, but is not something that I covered. Sorry.
Oh, good. Okay, we got a couple more coming in, so
Okay, because
we'll
yeah,
go with
I
a
just
few
want to
more.
apologize for going so short. So this is
No,
good.
no, 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 it's all good. Okay, so let me see here. Do you have any information about how Prince Hall came to Freemasonry?
Ooh, that's a great question. I can't say that I do. Yes, stonemason work, but I also I've had a struggle with him. He's one that we don't have a person asset for, and I see the need for more resources on Prince Hall. Because I was even talking to Sean the other day about like some contradicting information online, which also is because of how things were, like a lack of recording, you know, his birthday, how he was, whether his status as a free or enslaved person, which I saw someone made a good point about his age and potential of how he was enslaved or like how he was indentured, not chattel, or it was possible, kind of that those hypotheses that we could be making here today. Um, I'd have to do more research on him, which is someone I was like, I think we need to do more to work on telling his story accurately.
Did have just a general question. Someone who was curious about Anthony Burns, remember the name, but not who it was. Did you want to just give like a quick synopsis of Burns?
Yeah, if I knew I had all this time, when I talked about the fugitive slave law, I could have gotten into Burns, 1854. So after the passing of that federal fugitive slave law, slave catchers were coming here to Boston. Like I said, people harboring fugitives could have been held liable or could have even been deputized to aid and assist in apprehending fugitives. One of those, and I use those terms interchangeably, freedom seeker and fugitive. I kind of prefer freedom seeker, but fugitive, someone who's committed a crime and is on the run. Burns comes here to Boston and is taken. He's held in a nearby courthouse. There's a meeting held at Faneuil Hall. I'm giving the cliff notes, by the way, so great resources on our website. There's even a video, but Burns is sent back to enslavement in June 1854. There's all of these different reactions to seeing Burns. Abolitionists wear black. They kind of see it as a funeral. They have a coffin that says like liberty, kind of implying liberty is dead. He's marched down to a wharf. A ship brings him back to enslavement. He is arrested for a little while and unfortunately abused. And that's kind of where the abolitionist community here loses track of Burns. Like I said, giving the shorthands, there's so much more you could learn about him, especially to think about him, or like I see his picture from Oberlin College going on to attend university, kind of reminds me like these are real stories. Like when we did there was the exhibit for the Haydens at the Athenaeum and seeing the handcuffs on display, which I think are still at Revolutionary Spaces or in their collection now. But just knowing that those are the real handcuffs that Anthony Burns wore, it kind of reminds me like these are real stories. We had enslavement in our state. We even had slave catchers coming here taking fugitives or freedom seekers back to enslavement. So these are things that we can still learn from and talk about. And Shadrach Menkins, yes. Thomas Sims and others.
Yeah. All right, so we did have another general question just about Elizabeth Freeman. And did the emancipation of Elizabeth Freeman lead to the emancipation of others? Resulting in like general emancipation, or was it more gradual?
Yeah, I think that's where them being Quock Walker and Elizabeth Freeman using the Constitution to argue their legal cases, or them and their lawyers, is really where it started to open up for more freedom suits. So I could find the link that I was using to really get into some of the freedom suits that the Mass Historical Society covers. It's kind of like you might be from a smaller town outside of Boston and may see the link and you're like, whoa, my town had someone who had to fight for their equality. And it's like, yep, it's not just, I know I focused a lot on here in Boston, but she's from Sheffield, and there are others. So yeah, I think that's the exact link. Thank you. I know that it definitely was some of those initial suits that would go on to abolish slavery statewide.
Great. Well, a lot of supportive comments in the chat. Really appreciate that. Also really appreciate a very active chat with a lot of questions. It's really wonderful. So, thank you so much, Jen, for sharing your knowledge and passionate delivery. Really appreciate that.
Thank you. Yeah, I appreciate everyone joining in the chat because it helps me to learn as well. And yeah, I hope that you liked a short little info chat there. Now I know I can keep talking and going on. Sometimes I'm like, oh, I'm gonna be on for hours, which I guess I could have added more and we could have talked more, but you can enjoy the rest of your evening. And thank you for participating, and to Karen and the BPL for having us.
Oh my goodness. Jen, Sean, my mind is blown. I love this so much. I love everyone joining us from home and for wherever you guys are on your computers. I really, really, really appreciate it. I know the National Parks really, really appreciates it. And honestly, check out their websites. There was a lot of links dropped in the chat. I'm also kind of keeping it going a little bit for you guys just so you can click on them all and get them all open on your screen a little bit just in case. Because I deep dive their website all the time. Also, their story, the Freedom Seeker maps are amazing. I don't know if anyone checked out the branches. A few of the branches had physical maps. We made them into physical maps last year, and they were really, really cool. They're really big, which is really interesting. Also, what I really enjoy is the fact that I'm a lifelong thought person from Boston, from Belmont, Mass. Okay, I'm sorry, right outside Boston. Um, but a lot of this stuff, I think I know Boston's history. I'm like, I've known it since the third grade. Got it. I walked the Freedom Trail. I don't know it. At any time you guys have a presentation, it's all brand new info to me. And that's what I really, really appreciate about all of the work that you guys do because you're teaching us and showing us that what we know is history is not, it's just what we know. There's so much more out there, and there are more narrators and more people's stories that we don't know. That's what I'm trying to get at. There we go. That's why I usually have a script, guys, because I can keep going. All right. Sean, Jen, National Parks, I love all of you guys so much. Truly, truly appreciate you guys being here. And our next one will be in 2 weeks. See you then. Oh, the light turned off. It's telling me to go. Thank you so much, everyone. See you guys later.